and people are getting really into the weeds with it. So now this kind of new atheist, like science versus religion, problem of evil, it's kind of boring. People don't really care about it. They want like the biblical stuff. One of the most important apologetical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus is the fact that the tomb was found empty. Right? Jesus is laid in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea, and then there's an empty tomb. The disciples go to the tomb and it's empty. Now, this is, again, we're having a conversation, so this works. Because this isn't like some definitive proof of anything, but it's interesting that if you look at how the tomb is described in the Gospels, in Mark's Gospel, it's a tomb. In Matthew's Gospel, which is the next latest, it's a new tomb. Why is it a new tomb? Oh, because one of the most important observations of the Gospels is that the tomb was empty. But you could bury multiple bodies in a tomb. And so how do you know that Jesus had actually gone? What if he got mistaken for a different body? What if he got lost? What if there were loads of it? The important thing is that the tomb was empty, so we know that there was a body in there that's not there anymore. So Matthew's Gospel says it's a new tomb, because if it's new, no one else had been laid in it before. By the time you get to Luke's Gospel, it's described as a tomb in which no one had been laid. It's specified that no one had been laid in the tomb. And John's Gospel goes to the double whammy. It says, laid in a new tomb in which no one had been laid. So there's this like subtle indication, like is there like this increasing emphasis on the emptiness of the tomb? And so they really wanted to, and maybe the tomb actually was a new tomb in which no one had been laid, but they just felt like it was more important to emphasize that. Or maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe it just happens to be the way that they're describing the tomb. But there's stuff like that, which if you read through the Gospels, there is absolutely no way you would notice that. There's no way you would notice that unless you have a specific question in mind. You go back to the Gospels and you read through them with that question in mind, which is what biblical scholars do, which is why even now, after thousands of years, people are still discovering things about the Gospels. Like something like that. You can imagine thousands of years, no one's noticed that sort of developmental description of the tomb. And then finally someone's like, this is kind of interesting. That kind of stuff is still happening because the Gospels are so dense and there's so much in them. And there's so many things that seem completely irrelevant unless you're asking the right kind of question. And that's one of them. So I'd love to know what Wes thinks about that, for example, and whether that at all influences his idea about motivations of the Gospels. That's a lot weaker than the obvious motivation in the Gnostic literature that he's talking about. But it's an interesting consideration, and I would love to know what he thinks, for example. And if that were a debate, that point that I've just made is nowhere near strong enough to make like an argument out of. To say, well, hold on a second, Wes, because here's some evidence of motivate. So I wouldn't use it. So it wouldn't get discussed. And people wouldn't know about it. But in a conversation, it's like, oh, hey, that reminds me of this, and let's talk about it. So it's so much more interesting for everyone as well, you know?
That's why I like that idea rather than the more formal format. Because, there's people who aren't going to be moved or swayed by anything based on, it doesn't matter if you tell them that wall is white there, here's the scientific reason why, they're still they're saying it's fucking black. But then there's a lot of people out there who, they just want to hear different ideas, and not one thing has to be 100% right or 100% wrong, and they want to try to get to the truth. It's like, I always talk about how I think one of the worst, curses that we've cast upon ourselves in humanity is making science and religion diametrically opposed to each other. They both seek the same answer. Why not work together?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's not what wins the clicks. But there are a lot of people who might think that way.
These days, I think maybe the trend is reversing. Like
I hope so.
If you hosted a debate that was like science versus religion, I don't think anyone clicks on it because it's like kind of a dead horse. Like it was really popular during the whole height of new atheism and stuff like that, but people kind of lost interest. It's boring. Now people are more interested. Like the stuff about Jesus claiming to be God, for example. I just did this debate on whether Jesus claimed to be God in the Gospels.
Who'd you debate?
David Wood, who's a Christian YouTuber. And I think it's a pretty popular topic, which is surprising because it's like a point of like scriptural exegesis. But that kind of stuff is more interesting to people now because Christianity is experiencing a sort of popular revival in the online space. It's becoming cool again, and people are getting really into the weeds with it. So now this kind of new atheist, like science versus religion, problem of evil, it's kind of boring. People don't really care about it. They want like the biblical stuff, which is really interesting. And so now,
why do you think that happened?
Because it's just been done. Like we've had the debates and the discussions and like
no why do you think because I completely agree with you, there's been a phenomenon online that has spread to the real world where Christianity has become like very cool, which that's fine. I'm just curious why you think that's happened.
I'm not a sociologist, but there are some hypotheses. One is that Christianity is right all along, and people are beginning to realize it again. That's one explanation. Another explanation is to remember. You like that one, don't you?
Your mic wasn't on, but Alessi clicked.
Another explanation is that
he's such a good sport. I love this.
Like, you could think that, like, look, New Atheism was cool. It was really cool, and it was a phenomenon. If you were alive, like, in 2008, 2009, I mean, I was alive, but I was like 9 years old, but you know what I mean? Like, you would have seen, like, the intellectual space become dominated by atheism. And it's happened throughout history. It happens in the Victorian era, kind of coinciding with Charles Darwin, and suddenly the intellectual elite, they're all atheists all of a sudden. And then you've got like religious revivals happening, and you get the growth of Mormonism out of revivals in America, and sort of goes back and forth, and like New Atheism crops up, and it's really cool, and everyone's talking about it, and it's cool to be an atheist. And when you imagine a Christian, you imagine like your school teacher, sort of happy-go-lucky, and you've got the cool atheist in a leather jacket, like, well, actually, miss, you don't know about this, right? And okay, that's cool, but now, because people have gotten used to that and they begin to see through it, now when you think of an atheist, you think of the Reddit user with the fedora, and the Christian is the sort of like based Giga Chad, like, you know what I mean? And so it's like a cultural shift, and so why was New Atheism so popular? Well, maybe because it was cottoning onto something, or maybe it was just a publishing fad, and we've got kind of a YouTube publishing fad right now, Christianity. But that's one hypothesis. Maybe it is actually just experiencing a growth, because it always seems to come back. But I think things just ebb and flow. I think you're right. Christianity is sort of coming up, and then suppose like Joe Rogan converts to Christianity, that'd be huge, become a big thing, and then 5 years down the line,
it won't be cool,
and Rogan's talking about Christianity again, and it's like the same stuff, and all of these arguments people right now find really interesting. Like, gosh, why did the disciples die for their beliefs, and all of this kind of, that's so interesting. All of that is just like is water under the bridge, and suddenly the guy who comes in and goes, well, actually, I think that might be a mistranslation of the Greek. It's like, oh, hello, this is fun, And so New Atheism before was all about the problem of evil and religion being evil. I don't think like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens know like a word of Greek. I mean, I don't know. But like all of these criticisms that we've been talking about, all of this interesting stuff. Well, did Jesus claim to be God? What about this translation? That stuff just kind of doesn't come up. There was a little bit about the virgin birth, actually, that Richard Dawkins likes to talk about. That's kind of interesting. But outside of that, like, no, it's like a different approach. And so if atheism becomes cool again, it's not going to be that New Atheism style. It's going to be something else.
It'll be a new version.
It's going to be scholarly. Because I think what people are interested in now is like the scholarly stuff, which for me is really exciting. I'm amazed that I've essentially become mostly interested in biblical scholarship. I used to be like a philosopher, essentially, or like a wannabe philosopher, analytic philosophy.
An Oxford philosopher.
Arguments, logical positivist, sort of arguments of the existence of God, premises, conclusions, syllogisms, all that kind of stuff. And I used to think that the rest was basically all like bunk. And now I just don't care about your stupid premises, man. I want to read the Bible. That's what I'm interested in. And it's amazing that that's happened. But I think that that's happening across the board, and people are interested in the text. And I'm constantly discovering things, especially in this debate about whether Jesus is claimed to be God or not. There are all, like, Christians often look at me like I've said that a square has three sides when I say Jesus didn't claim to be God, because it's like this obvious fact of the Gospels. In biblical scholarship, for the past few hundred years, it's been mainstream just to say that Jesus didn't actually historically claim to be God. And that's like a later development into the doctrine.
Oh, they admit that?
Well, admit that is a strong term. Like, there are scholars who think that's the case. There are some scholars who think that's not the case. And a lot of biblical scholars are non-religious. So I think Morris Casey, for example, isn't a Christian, or wasn't a Christian when he wrote his, I forget what it's called. It's called like Jewish Prophet to Gentile God, I think, which is kind of a proto-version of the most popular biblical scholar at the moment. It's probably Bart Ehrman, who you should have him on the show. I mean, he's fantastic.
Yeah, his name's come up.
He is phenomenal, man. He's great. But like a lot of Christians look at him and say, yeah, he's kind of cool, but he's actually not that great, because I think he's made some blunders in the past and stuff like this as well. Like, I remember when I was talking about this West Huff thing, my friends were pointing me to something that I wish I could remember it for fairness' sake, but something that like Bart had written that had a similar level of like just getting something wrong. I think it was about the telephone game, actually.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.